Now, it is election day in Northern Ireland tomorrow. Such treats are meant to come along only every 5 years, but the two main parties in the governing coalition there fell out, and so only 10 months after the last election, everyone's voting again. Sinn Féin pulled the plug on the executive after a row about the escalating cost of a renewable heating scheme. But Brexit and deeper differences over the legacy of the Troubles also divided Sinn Féin from the Democratic Unionists. Well, the expectation now is that those two old governing parties will be back as the potential two new governing parties post-election. In case you'd thought you could peel your eyes away from politics in Northern Ireland, as though it had all become rather prosaic, it could get interesting again. Our political editor Nick Watt reports.
Over the past quarter of a century, the Northern Ireland peace process has ebbed and flowed. Now, after a decade of unbroken power sharing, the political settlement is facing a grave challenge. Northern Ireland has been transformed beyond recognition since I first reported from here in the days when armed squaddies still patrolled the streets. Now Belfast is a thriving city with gleaming new buildings. But nearly 20 years on from the Good Friday Agreement, ancient divisions are haunting this election. Very old memories of the border have been thrown up by the very new challenge of Brexit. Northern Ireland's largest party, the DUP, supported Brexit, but nationalists voted overwhelmingly in favour of Remain amid fears that Brexit would lead to an EU border cutting across the island of Ireland. The former US Senator who chaired the Good Friday Agreement has told Newsnight he hopes the UK government will ensure there is no return to the hard border of the past.
I can recall my first days there when it was very difficult to move back and forth across that border. It was heavily militarized, and it's been a huge difference now with people moving freely back and forth, reducing stereotypes, reducing the possibility of demonizing those who are other in any way.
One of the architects of the peace process believes that the UK's decision to sever most of its links with the EU customs union means that a hard border will be unavoidable. The possible return of customs officials at new border posts, unseen in decades, could be used by dissident Republicans to justify their campaign of violence.
Of course, there is no doubt about it. Well, I don't think it will set off those people who, small as they are, and always dangerous, because anyone who plays the game of armed struggle or violence is always the danger. They would see checks on the border and customs offices on the border, and the identification of the border as in some way justifying the kind of things that they always have in their mind.
Tony Blair's former Chief of Staff issued a starker warning.
I believe it will be very dangerous if you start having to have a hard border again. If you put in blocks along the border, people are going to be trying to destroy those, and that will create problems. If you set up border checks, even if those border checks are 10 miles one side or the other of the border, you're setting people up in static positions that makes it incredibly easy to shoot at them. And as soon as they come out of those checks, they will be easy to shoot at. Now, the dissidents are tiny. The dissidents are not really a threat. They're not in any way comparable to the old IRA. But it takes very few people to start murdering officers in those circumstances. And once they start murdering them, it's very hard to know how to react. You start getting into that cycle of radicalisation, repression all over again, and that is not what we want.
But an advisor to the former Ulster Unionist leader and Northern Ireland First Minister David Trimble believes that today's so-called soft border may eventually be preserved.
It may well in the end be a soft border. 2 or 3 years from now is the time you'd want to have an election, when some of these issues might have been amicably sorted out. This is a dreadful moment to have an election.
Concerns over Brexit will complicate attempts to re-establish the power-sharing executive. If the two largest parties in each community, likely to be the DUP and Sinn Féin once again, fail to reach agreement, then the UK government may be obliged to reimpose direct rule.
I think there's every danger that we could go back to direct rule, and I hope that focuses minds, both minds in Northern Ireland, minds in Dublin, but also minds in London. I think it is a mistake for the British government to stand back quite so far on this issue. That was the trouble in the 1960s. The British government tried to ignore Northern Ireland. The Home Office was responsible for it. Letters that came in were returned saying, this is nothing to do with us. This is something to do with us. We do have to play a role.
The collapse of the power-sharing executive has exasperated Jonathan Powell, a veteran of the Good Friday Agreement.
Clearly we have a breakdown in trust, and that's why there are elections. But I think it's interesting that people as different as Martin McGuinness and Ian Paisley were able to make this system work. And here were two sworn enemies, two people who played a crucial role in bringing about the Troubles, and yet they were able to make a power-sharing executive work. The real question is, can a new generation, a generation who are not themselves involved in the Troubles, even if their families had been, can they make a new system work?
Northern Ireland's divided communities are hearing some familiar tunes in this election, which has something of a retro feel. Bertie Ahern says people waiting for normal bread-and-butter politics should be patient.
I remember when I was a young politician in Leinster House, maybe in the late 70s, an old politician from one of the southern counties said to me that he detected in the 1977 election that the Civil War politics was coming to an end. You know, so that was the South. I don't expect the North to move, maybe not as slow, but not as quick either.
After 3 decades of violence, the Good Friday Agreement was designed to end the conflict by giving all the main parties a seat in government in a system which defies the usual rules of democratic politics.
The agreement was structured in a way to meet the needs at that time. That required power sharing. It required institutions that are unique to this circumstance. When and how those institutions should be altered or modified or changed is up to the people and the political leaders of Northern Ireland. They are the best judges of that. They will make that determination because they are the ones affected by it. I didn't expect when I, along with my colleagues General de Chastelain and Prime Minister Holkary, drafted the document that became the Good Friday Agreement, we didn't expect that that would be written in stone.
Northern Ireland's once mighty parties have tried to forge a more traditional democratic system by pulling out of government to sit in a cross-community opposition. This is a tricky sell at election time.
I think the developments with the SDLP and the UUP are quite interesting, really. The idea that they would have, if not a formal vote-sharing agreement across the sectarian divide, is a progressive development. Now they are, I mean, some people describe Northern Ireland as almost like 2 separate electorates. You almost have like a nationalist electorate and a unionist electorate. Well, if they cooperate in this way, that changes that to some degree.
A conflict which once seemed intractable has been largely quiet for the best part of 2 decades. Nobody is predicting a return to the violence of the past, but these elections show that the Northern Ireland political settlement has entered a fragile phase.
Nick Watt there, and Nick is actually at Stormont for us tonight. And Nick, well, the election may not resolve very much. I mean, what happens next, do you think?
Well, if the polls are to believe, then the DUP and Sinn Féin will emerge once again after these elections as the 2 largest parties in Northern Ireland. And what that means is the onus is on them to restore that power-sharing executive. Now, as things stand at the moment, it looks pretty difficult to see how they're going to hammer out a deal. And what that could mean is that the UK government, on the 45th anniversary of the first imposition of direct rule from London over Northern Ireland at the height of the Troubles, that Westminster could once again take charge of all of Northern Ireland. Now, the signs are that James Brokenshire, the Northern Ireland Secretary, is absolutely determined to do everything he can to ensure that that mammoth step does not have to be taken. So what that means is very serious talks amongst the parties, but they cannot go on forever. The legislation talks about how they can last for a reasonable period of time. And it was interesting that Bertie Ahern, the former Irish Prime Minister, in my interview, he said that perhaps the rules could be tweaked to allow those talks to last for as long as 6 weeks. There's even talk of possibly having a second election to concentrate minds. But I do have to say, in the rain here in Northern Ireland, I don't really detect much appetite for yet another election.
Nick, thanks. Well, I should say you can see a comprehensive guide to the parties and candidates in tomorrow's election on the BBC News website. Now, one thing about President Trump that everyone will agree on is that he's smashed the old rules of political communication. He's dispensed with the conventions of political spin and obfuscation and reset the relationship between government and the media. Now, there's one man who did more than anyone to expose the nonsenses of those old rules, and that is Armando Iannucci, the creator of The Thick of It, bitingly satirising political spin and the clenched butt message control of New Labour, and back in the 90s producing The Day Today, parodying programmes like this with fake seriousness, if not fake news.
Susanna Gekkelois has broken through to the front line. This is her contribution to history.
This is the very heart of the conflict. The men here have been fighting non-stop for 3 days. We drove in at night, straight into the middle of a rocket battle.
The air now is thick with what they call here the electric cornflakes. We're under strict instructions not to leave the vehicle, but to drive on through.
With no cover, we ran across open space to a nearby house. We found an injured man. We did our best. There are always casualties in war. There was a family sheltering in the back room. We had no tongue in common, but through the universal language of mutual need, I knew she was saying, "Come, set your equipment up in our refuge. The world must see this mess." These brave people are now sleeping, but they know that tomorrow our aerials and transmitters could make this house a prime target. Chris.
Well, Armando Iannucci is with me. The world has changed quite a bit since The Day Today and The Thick of It, and indeed since Veep, the series he created in the US. So we're now, for him, the world and comedy. Good evening. As you look at the world, are you laughing very much at politics at the moment?
No. I should be, but I remember the night. I'm an avid watcher of political shows. I make these shows because I enjoy it, and I got very heavily involved in watching the American election coverage until the result, and then I actually couldn't watch television for about a week, or indeed read a newspaper.
You're tweeting an awful lot on Donald Trump. You're about 2 or 3 a day, or retweets.
Yeah.
And actually, we had Tom Friedman of the New York Times on this programme. He said, if you try and fight the guy or take him on, he'll suck your brain out. And I wonder whether he is sucking your brain out a bit.
That is his genius. And I think the great mistake